Have you ever walked into an unfamiliar place, perhaps an ancient ruin or a quiet, forgotten alleyway, and felt a strange, undeniable sense of recognition? A shiver down your spine, a whisper of a memory that isn't quite your own. Or perhaps you've experienced déjà vu, that peculiar moment where a new conversation or a fresh scene plays out before you, yet your mind insists you've lived it all before, down to the smallest detail. It's a fleeting sensation, often dismissed as a trick of the mind, a glitch in our perception of time. But what if these weren't mere psychological curiosities, but something far more profound? What if they were genuine echoes, faint reverberations from lives lived long ago, carried within the very fabric of our being? For centuries, the idea of inherited memory existed only in myth and folklore, whispered tales of ancestral spirits or bloodlines carrying the wisdom of their forebears. Science, however, offered a more concrete explanation. Our genetic code, DNA, is a blueprint for physical traits, a recipe for building a body, from the color of our eyes to the shape of our bones. It dictates our predispositions to certain conditions and even influences aspects of our personality. But the prevailing understanding was that DNA did not store complex sensory experiences. The feeling of a cold winter wind on a distant plain, the intricate patterns of a long-forgotten constellation, or the taste of a peculiar ancient fruit. Our individual memories, it was believed, were formed and stored within the intricate neural networks of our own brains, unique to each lifetime. But was it possible that this seemingly solid understanding overlooked a hidden truth, encoded deeper than we could ever imagine? This understanding, solid as it seemed, began to shift with a series of breakthroughs in neurogenetics and epigenetics in the late 21st century. Researchers, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the deeper functions of DNA, started to uncover what they cautiously termed latent genetic pathways. These weren't entirely new discoveries, but rather a reinterpretation of previously overlooked segments of our genetic code. Imagine our DNA as an immense, multi-layered library. For generations, scientists had been meticulously cataloging the books that described how to build and operate the physical body. But then, a pioneering neuroscientist, Dr. Aris Thorne, and his team began to hypothesize that there were other, less obvious sections, perhaps vast, dormant archives, that held a different kind of information. Not just instructions for a body, but patterns, sequences, and subtle chemical markers that could influence and even replicate complex neural activity. The initial findings were subtle, almost imperceptible. Dr. Thorne's early theoretical work suggested that certain epigenetic tags, molecular markers that sit atop DNA and act like on-off switches regulating gene expression, weren't just influenced by an individual's diet or stress levels, but could also be subtly influenced by deeply impactful sensory-rich experiences. These tags, he posited, could then be passed down, not as a direct memory, but as a potential for a memory, a predisposition for the brain to fire in a certain way when encountering similar stimuli. It was like inheriting a musical score, not the performance itself, but the intricate instructions that could allow the performance to be recreated. This wasn't about a literal recording device within our cells, but a far more sophisticated biological encoding, where the patterns of neural activity associated with an emotion or a vivid sensory input could be subtly impressed upon the genetic material, ready to be read or activated under specific circumstances. But what kind of profound experiences could leave such an indelible mark on our very genetic code? Then came the first undeniable glimpses, occurring spontaneously and without warning across the globe. Initially, these were dismissed as mass hysteria, vivid dreams, or even early signs of neurological disorders. A young woman in Stockholm, gazing at a digital screen, suddenly experienced the overwhelming scent of damp earth and wood smoke, coupled with the chilling sensation of a raw, primitive fear, as if a great predator lurked just beyond her sight. For a few terrifying seconds, her modern apartment vanished, replaced by a dense, ancient forest shrouded in twilight. A historian in Cairo, while examining a newly unearthed artifact from the Old Kingdom, was momentarily overwhelmed by the taste of a bitter, unfamiliar gruel and the profound weariness of backbreaking labor under a scorching sun, feeling the rough texture of granite beneath his calloused hands. These weren't just visual hallucinations. They were full-spectrum sensory immersions, complete with emotions that felt utterly alien, yet intensely real. People began reporting these experiences with increasing frequency. A chef in Naples, tasting a new blend of herbs, might suddenly experience the overwhelmingly aromatic spices of a Silk Road caravan, a market bustling with unknown dialects and the heavy scent of exotic timbers. A child playing in a suburban park could suddenly be gripped by the unshakable certainty that a specific patch of ground, now covered by swings and slides, was once a sacred burial site, experiencing a wave of reverence and sorrow that defied their young understanding. These weren't memories of their own childhoods or things they had read. They were fragments, often lasting only seconds, yet intensely vivid and deeply unsettling. They were like static on a radio, brief bursts of a forgotten broadcast, hinting at a much larger unseen transmission. Could these fleeting perceptions truly be keys to unlocking an entire ocean of ancestral experiences? The scientific community, initially skeptical, could no longer ignore the mounting anecdotal evidence. Dr. Aris Thorne, who had already been exploring the theoretical underpinnings of such a phenomenon, found his work suddenly thrust into the spotlight. He proposed that these spontaneous glimpses were instances where these latent genetic pathways were being inadvertently triggered, perhaps by specific environmental cues, strong emotional states, or even subtle shifts in electromagnetic fields. These dormant memory potentials were briefly activating, allowing individuals to experience a fleeting echo of an ancestor's sensory world. It was a chaotic, uncontrolled release, like a dam breaking in 1,000 tiny fissures, letting out mere trickles of a vast reservoir. Thorne's laboratory became the epicenter of a new field of research, archaeoneuroscience. His team painstakingly collected and analyzed these disparate reports, looking for patterns, commonalities, and potential triggers. They developed sophisticated neural imaging techniques that could, for the first time, differentiate between self-generated memories and these inherited echoes, observing distinct patterns of brain activity when a glimpse occurred. For instance, ancestral memories often showed activation in deeper, phylogenetically older brain regions, contrasting with the more cortical engagement seen in personal recollection. It was a monumental challenge, akin to trying to piece together an ancient tapestry from a handful of frayed threads. Yet, the evidence mounted. These weren't psychological delusions, but genuine, biologically mediated experiences. What profound secrets might these ancient brain patterns truly hold? The scientific ambition quickly pivoted from merely observing these glimpses to consciously turning them on, and more importantly, interpreting them. If these pathways existed, Could they be deliberately stimulated? Could the trickles be turned into a steady flow, or even a torrent? The implications were staggering. Imagine unlocking not just abstract information about the past, but the lived experience of it. The taste of prehistoric berries, the warmth of a Neanderthal fire, the terror of a saber-toothed cat, the exhilaration of a first discovery, the communal bond of an ancient tribe. This promised to be nothing short of a revolution in human understanding, offering an unprecedented window into the vast, unspoken history of our species. Dr. Thorne's early theoretical work, once considered fringe, now formed the bedrock of a global initiative. He envisioned a future where humanity could access a shared collective memory, a library of all human experience encoded within our very cells. The challenges were immense, both scientific and ethical. How could one safely navigate such a profound internal landscape? What would it mean for individual identity to be flooded with the experiences of countless others? But the promise was too great to ignore. The echoes within were growing louder, transforming from whispers to insistent calls, inviting humanity to step across the threshold into a past that was not merely historical, but intensely personal and lived. The stage was set for a journey into the deepest archives of human consciousness, a journey that would forever redefine what it means to be human. But at what cost might such a profound connection to the past truly come? The initial fragments, the uncontrolled glimpses, had been like a faint melody on a distant, barely tuned frequency. But the true ambition of Dr. Aris Thorne's research was never to merely observe these echoes. It was to build a bridge, a conscious pathway to the vast, inherited archive of human experience nestled within our very biology. The challenge was immense. How to transform latent genetic pathways, these complex biological encodings, into a controllable, immersive sensory stream. The breakthrough came through a sophisticated understanding of epigenetics and quantum biology. Epigenetics, for those unfamiliar, refers to changes in gene expression that do not involve alterations to the underlying DNA sequence itself. Think of it less as changing the words in a book and more like adding bookmarks, highlighting passages, or even changing the font size, all of which alter how the book is read and interpreted without rewriting the text. Dr. Thorne's team theorized that ancestral memories weren't stored as literal video files in DNA, but as complex, multi-layered epigenetic markers and protein structures that, when activated, could trigger specific neural network patterns in the descendant's brain, effectively replaying the sensory and emotional data. It was less a direct recording and more a biological resonance, perhaps influenced by subtle quantum entanglement at the subcellular level, allowing information to bypass conventional neural pathways. The technology developed to achieve this involved a highly refined bio-neural interface, a system of modulated electromagnetic fields precisely tuned to specific frequency patterns. This device, often colloquially termed the resonance engine, was designed to gently stimulate these dormant epigenetic markers within a participant's neural tissue, coaxing them to unfold their stored information. Imagine a finely tuned instrument played with such precision that it can draw out the hidden melodies of a silent score. The process was delicate, requiring meticulous calibration to avoid overstimulation or the accidental activation of too many conflicting memories at once, which could overwhelm the conscious mind. What profound internal journey awaited those brave enough to enter the resonance engine? The goal was not just to access information, but to achieve full sensory immersion. This meant that the activated genetic memories wouldn't just present as abstract data points or historical facts. Instead, they would flood the participants' senses with the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures of a life lived countless generations ago. It was a journey not through a history book, but through the very fabric of lived experience. Among the first individuals to participate in the Controlled Conscious Memory Access program was Ilara Vance. Her motivation was a blend of scientific curiosity and a profound personal yearning to understand the persistent, unsettling feelings of déjà vu that had plagued her since childhood. A sense of knowing places she'd never seen, feeling emotions that weren't her own. Ilara, a former archivist herself, felt an inexplicable pull towards the past, a feeling that something vast and forgotten was just beyond her reach. Her first controlled session took place in a meticulously sterile sound-dampened chamber. She lay reclined in a comfortable chair, electrodes subtly attached to key neural points, a soft hum filling the air as the resonance engine began its work. Dr. Thorne, his face a mask of focused intensity, monitored the complex readouts on a nearby console. The initial sensation for Ilara was a gentle warmth spreading through her brain, followed by a kaleidoscopic burst of colors behind her closed eyelids, like the northern lights dancing in fast forward. Then, the colors resolved, sharpened, and solidified into a scene. Could she truly be stepping into a world that existed tens of thousands of years ago? The first memory was a jolt of icy cold. It wasn't merely the idea of cold, but the biting wind-whipped chill that penetrated bone, a sensation Ilara had never truly known in a temperate modern life. She felt the rough, bristly texture of animal hides against her skin, the heavy weight of them, and the faint, earthy smell of cured leather mingled with wood smoke. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. Her eyes, or rather, the eyes of her ancestor, saw a vast, treeless expanse, a tundra stretching to a horizon dominated by towering, jagged peaks of ice. The sky above was a bruised purple grey, perpetually on the verge of snowing, yet stubbornly holding back. This wasn't a dream. It was real, more real than her own memory of breakfast that morning. She heard the crunch of frozen earth under heavy boots, the low, guttural grunts of fellow hunters, and then a sound that made the ancestral heart pound with a primal rhythm, the trumpeting roar of a woolly mammoth. The ground vibrated with its immense power. Ilara felt the surge of adrenaline, the mixture of terror and exhilaration, the collective purpose of the hunt. She felt the heavy, smooth shaft of a spear in her ancestor's hand, the tension in the muscles as the group moved, silent and determined, through the snow-dusted landscape. The smells were overwhelming: damp fur, sweat, the sharp tang of animal fear, and the distant, sweet scent of pine sap carried on the wind. The experience was not just visual and auditory, it was visceral. She tasted the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, felt the rough, frozen air scour her throat with each ragged breath. The sheer scale of sensory data was profound, a deluge of information that her modern brain struggled to categorize. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose of ancient life. Dr. Thorne's careful programming ensured these early journeys were relatively short, mere minutes in real time, though they felt like hours or even days to Ilara. How would her own consciousness ever integrate such an overwhelming cascade of borrowed sensations and emotions? As the memory faded, leaving Ilara disoriented but strangely invigorated, she processed the overwhelming immersion. It was not like watching a film or reading a book. It was being there, inhabiting another body, another mind, experiencing their reality directly. The distinction between her own consciousness and that of her ancestor blurred to an almost imperceptible degree, leaving her with an uncanny sense of having lived multiple lives simultaneously. Subsequent sessions brought forth a tapestry of different lives, different eras. She tasted forgotten foods, the surprisingly sweet pulp of ancient root vegetables roasted over an open fire, the rich, gamey flavor of smoked fish, the pure, cold taste of water scooped from a pristine stream. Each taste was accompanied by the full context of its preparation, the communal sharing, the deep satisfaction of sustenance in a harsh world. She felt the rough stone of a grinding tool against her ancestral hands, the rhythm of work, the satisfaction of creation. One particularly vivid journey transported her to a time of profound agricultural revolution, thousands of years later. She felt the heavy, fertile earth clinging to her ancestors' hands, the warmth of the sun on her back as she bent over young shoots. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil, growing crops, and the distant sweet smell of blossoming fruit trees. She heard the gentle lowing of domesticated cattle, the happy babble of children playing nearby, the simple, rhythmic songs sung during harvest. Here, the emotions were less about raw survival and more about the quiet joy of community, the deep satisfaction of hard work yielding abundance, the profound sense of belonging to a settled place and lineage. But what happens when the beauty of the past gives way to its terrors? But the ancestral archive was not solely a source of beauty or wonder. It also held moments of terrifying intensity. Elara found herself living through the fear of a sudden, violent raid on a small settlement, feeling the cold dread of an ancestor hiding in the brush, watching flames consume their home, hearing the guttural cries of the invaders and the desperate screams of the innocent. She felt the crushing weight of grief, the despair of loss, the raw, primal urge to protect one's kin. These experiences, though brief, left an indelible mark, a chilling echo that resonated even after she returned to her own present. The sheer scale of this newly accessible sensory data was staggering. It wasn't just individual memories, it was the entire experiential record of a lineage, a river of consciousness flowing from the very dawn of humanity. Each ancestor, with their unique life, their triumphs, their sorrows, their daily routines, contributed to this vast, unfathomable reservoir. Dr. Thorne's team hypothesized that what they were tapping into was not just a single thread, but a multitude of intertwined narratives, an ocean of human experience waiting to be explored. This meant that any individual with the right activation could potentially access the sensory experiences of countless predecessors, opening up an entirely new dimension of understanding what it means to be human. The boundaries of individual experience had just been shattered, replaced by an infinite inherited past. What then truly defines you when yourself contains echoes of so many others? Imagine a single drop of dye spreading through a clear glass of water. At first, it's a distinct splash, a vivid moment. But as it disperses, it changes the entire character of the water, subtly, irrevocably. This analogy, perhaps, best describes the initial profound personal consequences experienced by individuals who first gained conscious access to their ancestral genetic memories. The controlled immersion, initially a source of wonder and unparalleled insight, soon began to ripple outwards, touching every facet of their waking lives. For participants like Elara Vance, the immediate aftermath of a memory session was a complex tapestry of sensations. The vividness of an ice age hunt, the cold bite of the wind, the primal scent of damp earth and mammoth fur, didn't simply fade when the resonance engine was powered down. Instead, these experiences lingered, a faint but persistent echo beneath the surface of her own modern consciousness. She might find herself momentarily flinching at a sudden loud noise, as if still recalling the thundering hooves of an ancient herd, or feeling an inexplicable craving for the taste of wild berries and roots, a taste her modern palate had never known. It was as if a part of her brain, previously dormant, had been awakened and was now struggling to reconcile millennia of sensory input with the familiar present. This initial disorientation was only the prelude. As individuals continued to delve into the vast archives of their genetic past, accessing not just one or two ancestral lives, but dozens, then hundreds, the concept of a unique, singular self began to blur with alarming speed. It wasn't merely that new information was being absorbed, it was that fully formed, emotionally charged experiences were being overlaid onto their existing mental landscape. Imagine trying to read a single story, but finding countless other stories, written by different authors in different languages, appearing on the same page, sometimes overlapping, sometimes merging. This was the challenge. What happens when the stories of your ancestors become indistinguishable from your own? The once clear distinction between my memory and their memory began to erode. A person might recall a summer afternoon spent in a grandparent's garden with perfect clarity, yet simultaneously feel the phantom ache of a wound suffered by an ancestor in a long-forgotten skirmish, or experience a surge of protective love for a child who lived 5 centuries ago. The emotional resonance was identical, making it incredibly difficult to disentangle the source. This wasn't a simple intellectual understanding of history. It was a visceral, embodied experience of it. The I that woke up each morning was no longer just the product of one unique life, but a composite, a mosaic formed from countless fragments of lives long past, all demanding recognition within the same conscious space. This intertwining of personal and ancestral experiences quickly led to a profound existential crisis for many. People began to question the very foundation of their identity. If their deepest fears and greatest joys were not entirely their own, but echoes of a collective past, what then remained of their individuality? The familiar anchors of personal history, childhood memories, defining moments, learned skills, sometimes felt overshadowed by the sheer weight and intensity of inherited consciousness. A modern architect might find themselves instinctively understanding ancient building techniques, not through study, but through the muscle memory of a long-dead stonemason. A dedicated vegan might suddenly feel an overwhelming primal urge to hunt, a sensation entirely alien to their conscious beliefs. These were not choices, but impulses, deeply ingrained and powerfully felt, challenging the very notion of free will. Dr. Aris Thorne, observing these developments from the clinical setting, noted a new lexicon emerging among participants. Terms like memory bleed, ancestral resonance, and self-diffusion became common. He and his team documented cases where individuals exhibited skills they had never learned, preferences they had never cultivated, or phobias that had no basis in their own life experience. One participant, a mild-mannered librarian, developed an uncanny ability to navigate dense, unfamiliar forests, describing paths and landmarks she had never physically encountered, seemingly guided by the memory of an ancient tracker. Another found themselves fluent in a dead language, uttering phrases they had no conscious recollection of learning. Are these innate talents simply dormant ancestral memories awakening within us? The struggle to maintain individuality became a daily battle. Many tried to ground themselves in their present lives, focusing intensely on their immediate surroundings, their personal relationships, and their contemporary interests. They attempted to create mental barriers to consciously separate their own memories from the inherited stream. Some developed elaborate journaling practices, meticulously documenting their daily lives and thoughts, hoping to preserve a record of their unique self against the encroaching tide of ancestral experience. Others sought solace in shared activities, in the distinct modern interactions with friends and family, hoping that the collective present could outweigh the fragmented past. However, the psychological challenges were immense. New forms of mental distress began to emerge. Identity diffusion syndrome, as it was tentatively named, described a state where individuals lost their sense of personal continuity, experiencing themselves as a collection of disparate personalities and memories rather than a cohesive whole. Chronic anxiety and dissociation became common as the mind struggled to integrate such a vast and often contradictory array of experiences. Some reported episodes of temporal vertigo, a dizzying sensation of being simultaneously present in multiple time periods, unable to anchor themselves in any single moment. The sheer emotional burden of living through millennia of joy, suffering, love, and loss all at once proved overwhelming for many. Consider the simple act of choosing a career. For someone accessing ancestral memories, this decision might be influenced not just by their own aspirations, but by the echoes of a dozen different callings. One might feel a pull towards the land, remembering the quiet satisfaction of an ancient farmer. Another might experience a sudden, inexplicable revulsion for conflict, having lived through the terror of countless battles. Even something as personal as forming romantic relationships became complicated. How do you truly connect with another person when your consciousness is populated by the spectral presence of countless former lovers, spouses, and families, their emotions and attachments still resonating within you? The boundaries of personal connection became blurred, making genuine, unadulterated intimacy a rare and challenging feat. Daily life, once a predictable series of routines, transformed into a constant negotiation with the past. A walk through a city park might trigger memories of ancient forests, complete with phantom scents of pine needles and damp earth. A conversation with a stranger could unexpectedly evoke a feeling of deep familiarity or inexplicable distrust based on an ancestral interaction. The world, through the lens of genetic memory, became infinitely richer, yet also infinitely more complex and demanding. The ability to simply be in the present, to experience one's own life without the overwhelming overlay of countless others, became a precious and increasingly elusive state. This profound shift forced humanity to confront a startling truth. Perhaps the very uniqueness of individual consciousness, the clarity of our self, was not an inherent quality, but rather a beneficial consequence of precisely forgetting. The vast, overwhelming ocean of ancestral experience. The price of remembering, it seemed, was the potential fracturing of the self. Could this deliberate forgetting be humanity's oldest, most profound survival mechanism? As the initial disorienting waves of individual ancestral memories began to recede, or rather, to integrate into the fabric of personal consciousness, humanity collectively started to glimpse the true, monumental scale of the transformation. What had begun as a deeply personal journey into a borrowed past for individuals like Alara Vance soon rippled outwards, touching every facet of human society. The private existential crises of the rememberers quickly escalated into a public global phenomenon, irrevocably altering how people understood their world, their history, and ultimately themselves. The very concept of history, once a carefully curated narrative preserved in texts and monuments, underwent a fundamental seismic shift. Historians, archaeologists, and educators found their life's work simultaneously validated and utterly overturned. No longer were they piecing together fragments from pottery shards or deciphering ancient scrolls. Now, humanity could literally live through the past. Imagine a classroom where students don't just read about the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, but close their eyes and feel the grit of the sand, the strain of hauling colossal stones, the rhythm of ancient chants, the burning sun on their ancestors' skin. Or consider an anthropologist experiencing the sensory richness of a long, extinct language, not as a dead tongue, but as the living, breathing medium of an ancestor's thoughts and emotions. This unprecedented access, however, brought with it an overwhelming cascade of conflicting perspectives. For every grand narrative of conquest and civilization building, there were countless, often brutal counter-narratives. A revered national hero, seen through the eyes of a defeated foe, might appear as a ruthless tyrant. A glorious empire's expansion, celebrated in one lineage, was experienced as invasion, displacement, and profound suffering in another. Consider the expansion of a great empire across a continent, an event often recounted in histories as a triumph of ingenuity and will. Through ancestral memory, one could experience the exhilarating strategic brilliance of the generals, the pride of the soldiers, the bustling innovation in the capital city. Yet, in parallel, one could also feel the terror of the indigenous peoples whose lands were encroached upon, the searing pain of displacement, the loss of ancient traditions, the gnawing hunger of famine as resources were plundered. The scent of pine forest being cleared for new settlements might carry a promise of progress for one, and the bitter tang of irreversible loss for another. The sounds of celebratory drums from the conquering army could be heard simultaneously with the silent weeping of a dispossessed family. The sheer, undeniable reality of these lived experiences shattered simplistic historical understandings. Textbooks became obsolete overnight, as every historical event was suddenly illuminated by a kaleidoscope of personal truths. Debates raged in academic forums and public squares, not over interpretations of evidence, but over the reconciliation of directly experienced, often contradictory, memories. How could a society move forward when its foundational myths were revealed to be partial, self-serving, or even deliberately falsified by the sheer weight of inherited suffering? The question wasn't if history needed rewriting, but if it could ever be written again in a way that truly encompassed the infinite, often agonizing complexities of the past. Could a collective truth truly emerge from such a vast and contradictory tapestry of personal histories? This profound reshaping of historical understanding inevitably led to the most challenging ethical dilemma: how to confront ancestral wrongs. Could living through pivotal, traumatic events from both sides foster ultimate empathy? Or would it merely ignite deeper resentments and unhealable trauma? The promise was immense. A descendant of a slave owner might experience the crushing weight of bondage, the dehumanizing fear, the raw physical pain, the constant indignity, fostering an unparalleled understanding of inherited injustice. Conversely, a descendant of an oppressed people might, by accessing the memories of their oppressor, glimpse the fear, the economic pressures, the ideological indoctrination, or even the sheer ignorance that fueled historical atrocities. Such experiences could, theoretically, become a powerful catalyst for reconciliation, bridging divides that had seemed insurmountable for centuries. The possibility of truly feeling another's historical burden, of tasting their tears and smelling their fear, offered a path to a collective healing process built on undeniable shared reality. However, the reality was often far more complicated and frequently far more painful. The direct experience of ancestral suffering was not merely academic, it was visceral, traumatizing. Individuals relived massacres, famines, genocides, and systematic oppression with terrifying clarity. The lingering taste of ashes from a burnt village, the chilling echo of screams in a concentration camp, the phantom pain of ancient wounds. These were not distant historical facts, but living nightmares. For many, this re-traumatization intensified inherited grievances, transforming abstract historical injustices into raw personal wounds. Descendants of victims found themselves overwhelmed by waves of collective grief and anger, their present identity subsumed by ancestral suffering. Conversely, descendants of perpetrators, upon experiencing the cruelty of their forebears, grappled with profound, debilitating shame and guilt, even though they personally bore no responsibility for those past actions. This led to a new kind of social friction, a reignition of ancient feuds, not between nations or tribes, but between individuals carrying the unhealed scars of their respective lineages. Old wounds, once thought to be fading with time, suddenly gaped open, fresh and agonizing. Amidst this societal maelstrom, new social structures began to emerge, often organically. People, seeking solace or understanding, gravitated towards others who shared similar ancestral experiences, forming what quickly became known as memory communities. These were not based on current nationality, language, or even race, but on shared genetic lineages that carried specific historical echoes. A group of individuals, for instance, might discover they all shared ancestors who lived through a particular famine in the 17th century, or who participated in a specific migration across a vast ocean. They would gather, not just to discuss, but to collectively remember, sharing the sensory load, finding commonality in the bitter taste of bark eaten for survival, or the dizzying sway of a storm-tossed ship. These communities often transcended modern borders, bringing together people from different continents who suddenly discovered a profound, undeniable connection through a shared, lived past. These communities offered a sense of belonging and mutual processing, but they also introduced new forms of social stratification and, at times, exclusion. Some groups, particularly those with a history of severe ancestral trauma, became insular, wary of those whose lineages carried memories of oppression. New forms of social hierarchy subtly began to form, based on the perceived purity or richness of one's ancestral access, or the perceived burden of one's inherited history. There were debates about memory privilege, whether those with access to glorious or untroubled pasts had an unfair advantage over those constantly reliving profound suffering. Could such divisions lead to a new form of global inequality, based not on wealth, but on the echoes of the past? It was into this volatile, rapidly evolving landscape that Kai Chen stepped, a figure whose unique blend of global ethics and historical scholarship made him uniquely suited, yet profoundly challenged by the task at hand. Kai had spent his career navigating complex international disputes, always seeking common ground through shared human values. Now, the ground itself was shifting beneath humanity's feet, He was a man of quiet demeanor, with a mind that moved with the precision of a master clockmaker, accustomed to dissecting intricate moral quandaries. His initial reaction to the widespread access to ancestral memory was one of intellectual awe, a recognition of humanity's unparalleled opportunity for self-understanding, but this quickly gave way to a deep, gnawing concern as the societal consequences unfolded. Kai found himself chairing emergency international councils, tasked with drafting ethical guidelines for memory access, mediating burgeoning disputes between memory communities, and attempting to forge a path towards collective integration. His office, once a quiet space filled with ancient texts and philosophical treatises, now buzzed with the constant hum of holographic projections displaying real-time global memory conflicts and reconciliation efforts. He listened to testimony from individuals driven to despair by inherited guilt and from others consumed by ancestral rage. He witnessed the collapse of long-standing treaties as nations re-evaluated their historical narratives, and the surprising formation of new alliances based on shared lineage memories that crisscrossed traditional geopolitical lines. His task was unprecedented, without historical parallel. There were no established frameworks for processing a species-wide, direct confrontation with its entire past. How do you legislate empathy? How do you heal trauma that spans millennia? Kai worked tirelessly, his face often etched with fatigue, but his eyes always alight with a fierce determination. He proposed memory protocols, guidelines for safe and ethical ancestral memory engagement, emphasizing therapeutic support, voluntary participation, and the critical importance of distinguishing ancestral experiences from one's own identity. He advocated for the establishment of ancestral integration centers, places where individuals and groups could process their memories under expert guidance, focusing on understanding rather than retribution, often employing interdisciplinary teams of neurologists, historical sociologists, and psychologists. Kai Chen understood that the core challenge was not just about remembering, but about integrating. It was about finding a way for humanity to carry the immense, often contradictory weight of its collective past without being crushed by it. He believed that true empathy, while difficult and painful, was the only path forward. He argued that to truly forgive historical wrongs, one must first truly understand them, not just intellectually, but viscerally from all sides. But he also recognized the immense risk that instead of uniting, humanity could fracture into countless warring memory factions, each reliving its own selective traumas. The very definition of truth was now fluid, subjective, and inherited, making his quest for a unifying ethical framework a monumental, almost impossible endeavor. He often pondered, in the quiet hours, whether humanity was truly ready for the full weight of its own story, or if some things were simply too profound to bear. The ability to access ancestral genetic memories, once a distant dream, quickly revealed itself to be a double-edged sword, carving paths toward both unprecedented understanding and profound psychological distress. What began as a scientific marvel rapidly transformed into a crucible for the human spirit, testing the very limits of empathy and resilience. Living through the suffering and joys of countless predecessors offered an intimate, unfiltered view into the collective human experience, a spectrum of sensation and emotion previously unimaginable. Consider the profound moments of empathy that emerged. Individuals, often from vastly different modern cultures, found themselves sharing the primal fear of a common ancestor fleeing a saber-toothed cat across an ancient savanna, or the quiet joy of a harvest festival in a long-lost village. Ilara Vance, for instance, in one of her more controlled sessions, experienced the desperate hunger of a famine-stricken medieval peasant. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach, the weakness in the limbs, the desperate search for sustenance. It was not just an image, but a visceral, all-encompassing reality. Yet, in the very next sequence, she might find herself experiencing the overwhelming relief of that same ancestor, discovering a hidden patch of wild berries, the burst of sweet flavor on the tongue, the surge of energy, the profound gratitude. These shared, fundamental human experiences, stripped of historical and cultural overlay, forged unexpected bonds. People began to see the universality of the human condition, feeling the warmth of a parent's love for their child from 10,000 years ago, or the shared grief over a loss that transcended time. This direct, felt connection often dissolved centuries of learned prejudice and animosity. Imagine a person whose family history was intertwined with a period of conflict and oppression, now able to experience the world through the eyes of both the oppressor and the oppressed. Not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. They might feel the chilling fear of a person facing persecution, and then, in another memory stream, the complex motivations, the societal pressures, or even the fear and ignorance that drove the actions of those who inflicted harm. This isn't to justify atrocity, but to expose the intricate web of human choices and circumstances. Kai Chen, the ethicist, noted numerous instances where individuals, initially locked in generational grievances, found themselves struggling with a newfound, unsettling understanding. It was a difficult, often painful empathy, but it was genuine. It forced a re-evaluation of simplistic narratives, demanding a deeper, more nuanced appreciation of historical actors and their contexts. The global forums Kai chaired were filled with testimonies of people who, having lived through both sides of an ancient conflict, now sought reconciliation with an intensity never before witnessed. However, for every profound moment of connection and understanding, there were equally profound instances of trauma. The human mind, adapted to process a single lifetime's worth of experience, found itself utterly overwhelmed by the deluge of millennia. Participants often reported memory bleed, where the pain, fear, or despair of an ancestor would intrude upon their waking consciousness, feeling as real and immediate as their own emotions. Elara Vance, despite her resilience, found herself struggling after a particularly intense session, where she lived through the terror of a child separated from their parents during a tribal raid, followed by the slow, agonizing decline of a grandparent suffering from an ancient, untreatable disease. These weren't fleeting images. They were full sensory immersions, complete with the smells of smoke and fear, the sounds of distant cries, the cold grasp of despair. The cumulative effect of living through countless deaths, betrayals, and periods of immense suffering began to take a severe toll. The very fabric of their emotional well-being was stretched thin, sometimes to breaking point, with some experiencing inexplicable phantom aches and pains that defied medical explanation. The psychological landscape of humanity shifted dramatically, giving rise to entirely new forms of mental health challenges. Dr. Aris Thorne, initially focused on the mechanics of memory access, found himself increasingly drawn into the study of these emergent conditions. He coined terms like ancestral overload syndrome, characterized by chronic fatigue, vivid nightmares, and an inability to distinguish personal experience from inherited memory, and echo dissociation, where individuals felt detached from their present lives, lost in a labyrinth of past identities. In response, a new therapeutic discipline rapidly emerged: memory integration therapy. Clinics, often funded by bewildered governments and philanthropic organizations, began to appear in major cities worldwide. These centers, staffed by a new generation of psychologists, neurologists, and even historians, focused on helping individuals process the overwhelming influx of inherited experiences. Therapists in these integration hubs employed a blend of established psychological techniques and innovative approaches. They guided patients through structured re-entry protocols, helping them consciously separate ancestral memories from their personal narrative. Mindfulness exercises were adapted to anchor individuals firmly in their present bodies and timelines, while narrative therapy encouraged patients to reframe ancestral stories within the context of their own lives, giving voice to the past without letting it consume the present. One common technique involved creating memory maps, visual representations where individuals could chart the origins of their feelings and thoughts, distinguishing between what was truly theirs and what was an echo from a distant past. It was a slow, painstaking process, requiring immense patience from both therapist and patient, but it offered a lifeline to those drowning in the inherited ocean of consciousness. But could therapy alone truly heal wounds that spanned millennia? As the profound impact of ancestral memory access became undeniable, global debates ignited with unprecedented fervor. The question of who should be permitted to delve into this collective past and under what circumstances became a central, contentious issue. Governments scrambled to form regulatory bodies, while international organizations like the United Nations convened emergency summits. Kai Chen found himself at the epicenter of these debates, chairing the Global Ethics Committee for Ancestral Memory Access. The discussions were fraught with moral dilemmas and practical challenges. One faction argued for universal, open access, believing that the collective wisdom and empathy gained would outweigh the risks. They envisioned a future where shared understanding would eradicate conflict and foster a new era of global cooperation. Others advocated for strict regulation, fearing the weaponization of inherited trauma or the erosion of individual identity. They pointed to cases of memory-induced psychosis and the potential for malicious actors to manipulate historical narratives by selectively activating certain ancestral experiences. The military implications were chillingly clear. Imagine soldiers conditioned with the primal ferocity of ancient warriors, or negotiators armed with the intimate knowledge of an opponent's ancestral fears and vulnerabilities, altering geopolitical strategies overnight. Ethical considerations extended to consent. Could one truly consent to experience the trauma of an ancestor? What about the right to forget? The fundamental human capacity to move beyond past pains. Could future generations be burdened by the collective unresolved trauma of all who came before them, passed down through these latent genetic pathways? The age at which an individual could access memories was hotly debated, with some arguing for a mature age when personal identity was well established, and others advocating for early exposure to foster empathy from a young age. The debates raged in parliaments, in academic journals, and perhaps most intensely, in the homes of individuals grappling with their own inherited pasts. The world stood at a precipice, recognizing the immense power it now wielded. The spectrum of human experience had expanded infinitely, yet with that expansion came a profound responsibility. The discussions were not just about science or psychology. They were about the very definition of humanity, the boundaries of the self, and the kind of future society wished to build upon the foundations of an awakened past. The question lingered, heavy in the air. Could humanity truly integrate this vast, overwhelming inheritance, or would it be crushed beneath its weight? The path forward was unclear, fraught with both promise and peril, demanding a collective wisdom that was perhaps only now beginning to emerge from the echoes of time. The quiet hum of the resonance engine, once a beacon of scientific triumph, now echoed with a different kind of silence across the globe. It was a silence born of contemplation, of profound re-evaluation, as humanity grappled with the true cost of remembering. The initial euphoria, the thrill of walking through a mammoth hunt with an ancestor or sharing a quiet moment of joy in a forgotten village, had given way to a more complex reality. The question that now resonated in every mind, every council chamber, every individual's quiet moments, was stark and inescapable. What was truly more valuable? The unique, unburdened life we had always known, or access to the infinite, lived experience of those who came before us? This was not a theoretical debate confined to academic halls. It was a lived reality for millions. Individuals like Elara Vance, who had traversed countless ancestral landscapes, now carried the weight of millennia within their very sense of self. Their unique memories, the specific nuances of their own childhoods, their personal triumphs and heartbreaks, had become interwoven with the vast tapestry of inherited consciousness. The clarity of a singular, individual narrative, once so fundamental to human identity, was now clouded, enriched, and simultaneously diminished by the sheer volume of other lives. Imagine trying to recall your own first steps, only to have the memory overlaid with the first steps of 1,000 different children from 1,000 different eras, each with their own distinct feeling of triumph or stumble. The personal experience, while still present, became one voice in an overwhelming chorus. Many scientists, including Dr. Aris Thorne, who had pioneered this transformative technology, now reflected on a subtle yet profound evolutionary hypothesis. Perhaps human individuality, the very essence of our distinct personalities and unique life paths, was not merely an innate gift, but a direct result of a biological mechanism of precisely forgetting the vast ancestral past. For countless generations, the intricate sensory data of our forebears had been encoded within our DNA, but remained largely dormant, a potential rather than an active stream. This innate biological filter, this selective amnesia, might have been the crucible in which the unique self was forged. It allowed each new generation to begin with a relatively clean slate, free from the overwhelming emotional and experiential baggage of all who came before. Without this forgetting, would there have been space for truly novel thought, for divergent paths, for the invention of entirely new cultures and technologies? Would we be perpetually reenacting the past, rather than creating the future? The implications of this newfound understanding were staggering. If individuality was a product of forgetting, then remembering, in its most profound sense, threatened to dissolve the very concept of the distinct self. The subtle pulls of déjà vu, the inexplicable sense of belonging in a foreign land, these were no longer mysteries, but recognized whispers from the deep past. Yet, in their clarity, they brought a new kind of existential blur. The world found itself divided, not by old borders or ideologies, but by a fundamental philosophical schism. On one side stood those who argued for the full embrace of the shared past, seeing it as the ultimate path to unity, empathy, and a complete understanding of the human condition. They envisioned a future where collective wisdom, accumulated over millions of years, could guide humanity to unprecedented heights, dissolving prejudice and fostering a universal consciousness. To them, the burden of the past was a sacred inheritance, a reservoir of experience that, once fully tapped, would elevate humanity beyond its individualistic confines. Conversely, a powerful movement emerged advocating for the protection of individual autonomy. Led by ethicists like Kai Chen, they argued that while the shared past offered invaluable insights, its unbridled access posed an existential threat to what it meant to be human. They warned of the profound psychological and societal trauma, the ancestral overload syndrome, and the risk of humanity becoming paralyzed by an endless echo chamber of past conflicts and joys, unable to forge a unique path forward. They championed the sanctity of the present moment, the preciousness of an unwritten future, and the right of each individual to define their own life, unburdened by the literal lived experiences of countless others. For these advocates, the ability to forget was not a flaw, but a fundamental liberty, a biological mechanism that allowed for growth, innovation, and the continuous renewal of human potential. To surrender this, they argued, was to surrender humanity's capacity for true novelty and self-determination. Which path would humanity ultimately choose to navigate its extraordinary future? The societal landscape reflected this profound choice. In some regions, memory integration communes flourished, where individuals voluntarily immersed themselves in vast ancestral streams, seeking to live as part of a grander, collective consciousness. These communities often exhibited remarkable internal harmony, a deep understanding of historical grievances, and a profound sense of shared purpose. Yet, observers also noted a certain homogeneity, a quiet resignation to inherited patterns, and a diminished drive for individual achievement or radical innovation, with artistic expression often focusing on reinterpreting ancient forms rather than inventing new ones. In stark contrast, other nations or enclaves enacted strict regulations, limiting access to ancestral memories, or even developing technologies to help individuals filter or mute the overwhelming influx of information. These communities prioritized individual creativity, fostering environments where personal expression and unique identities were fiercely protected. Here, the drive for innovation remained strong, albeit sometimes accompanied by a return to older forms of societal friction, as the unifying force of shared ancestral experience was deliberately suppressed. Kai Chen, in his global address to the UN Council on Consciousness, articulated this dilemma with poignant clarity. We stand at a crossroads. Do we become an infinite library containing every story ever lived, but perhaps at the cost of writing new ones? Or do we safeguard the blank pages of our present, accepting the loss of boundless wisdom for the freedom to author our own unique future? The long-term implications for human evolution and the very definition of consciousness were now topics of fervent scientific and philosophical debate. Could humanity evolve to cope with this expanded consciousness, perhaps developing new neural structures capable of compartmentalizing or selectively accessing such vast data without mental collapse? Or would the continuous influx lead to a fundamental rewiring of the human brain, transforming individual minds into nodes within a grander, interconnected web of ancestral thought, fundamentally altering our neurological architecture? The concept of consciousness itself was shifting. Was it still the subjective experience of a single organism? Or was it becoming a multi-layered, multi-temporal phenomenon, a symphony of countless lives echoing through a single being, a cosmic web of experience? Some theorists proposed a future where humanity transcended its biological limitations, moving towards a form of collective consciousness, a unified mind composed of billions of past and present experiences. Others warned of a potential regression, where the individual spark, the unique flicker of personal awareness, might be extinguished under the weight of an eternal, unyielding past. The future of art, law, and even love hung in the balance. Would creativity become an act of rediscovery, or could true novelty still emerge from such a crowded mind? Would justice be served by living through both sides of every conflict, or would it merely breed an endless cycle of inherited grievances, where every legal precedent was contested by 1,000 personal traumas? Would love still be a unique connection between two individuals, or a recognition of shared ancestral bonds? As the world moved forward, navigating this unprecedented era, the choice remained. Humanity stood on the precipice, gazing into the vast ocean of its own past. The ability to remember everything was a power beyond comprehension, a gift and a curse intertwined. It revealed the profound interconnectedness of all life, the shared joys and sorrows that bind us across the eons. But it also illuminated the quiet, profound strength found in the singular moment, in the uncharted territory of our own unique existence. The ultimate decision lay ahead, whether to fully embrace the infinite, overwhelming tapestry of what has been, or to protect the sanctity and autonomy of the individual present, allowing new threads, new colors, and new stories to be woven into the fabric of time. And perhaps, in the end, our true inheritance is not just the memories themselves, but the profound, ongoing question of what it truly means to live, to forget, and to remember.